Perfect Earth is devoted to changing the way we relate to and manage our properties for our health and health of the planet. And so when Laura, one of our board members, told me about a podcast that she had heard on Bulletproof Radio with Zach Bush, she said, this is just so us. And she was right, and so we decided, well, let's just call him up and ask him to come and speak. So here he is.
Have the great fortune of traveling widely right now, and every place I go where I've never been, including this one, I've never been to Long Island, and never seen the vast majority of you. And I'm always struck by just the sheer beauty of humanity. We are a beautiful species, and there are so many other species around us that are beautiful and are really seemingly here to support us. And so we're going to take a look at that today. There's a miracle among us in the invisible realm that I'm going to introduce you to today and let you know kind of what our recent society has conspired to do to bring us to this tipping point of humanity, and the empowering message that we all created that together, and that therefore we can all change it. A lot of the science that you're going to see today is kind of jaw-dropping, and it's like, well, if we know that, then why hasn't everything changed? And I think one of the reasons it hasn't changed is because we tend to be in a very fight or flight state or very combative mindset when we see really devastating things happening around us, and we tend to attack, in this case, the chemical companies or the political systems or legislative systems or our government's not doing enough or all these things. And I hope to keep coming back to the fact that you and I created this situation through our own lifestyles, and therefore we have the power to completely transform everything around us, irregardless of what the government thinks or is doing, irregardless of what the companies are doing or saying, because frankly we created them through our own participation in this social and political as well as business environment. So it's an empowering message in the end, and I feel like I'm far from a whistleblower and more of an opportunist. As a human, I'm very opportunistically interested in the survival of our species. And that has become in question recently. The question exists because these numbers here. So over the last just 20 years, these numbers have come out of nowhere. Autism has now hit 1 in 36 children in the United States. 1 in 36 is an extraordinary number in and of itself when you think of a single kindergarten class that usually is somewhere between 24 and 32 children. You're approximately every single kindergarten class in the country now looking at an autistic child or somebody affected. Within that schoolroom, you've got 1 in 8 that are affected by attention deficit. So there are going to be 3 or 4 kids in that single classroom that are heavily affected by attention deficit and diagnosed and treated. And they're treated with speed, adrenaline. And so they're treated with a drug that stimulates their brain just like speed does. And of course, that shuts down the creative environment of the brain. And so when we are in an adrenaline fight or flight state, we can't have a creative thought. And it's concerning that we have a significant portion of our children in the elementary school environment on these medications. Recent statistics are suggesting that 1 in 3 young adults in college have taken these speed drugs while in school. And so Adderall and Ritalin are the 2 major ones, and the vast majority of those 1 in 3 college kids didn't get it from their doctor, they actually got it from their friends. And so these drugs are being circulated as a way to focus long enough to take a multiple choice test. And so if we have 1 in 3 of our college students taking drugs that again shut down their creative center, it really begs the question of what are we teaching and what do we expect this generation to produce on the backside of this system that we've created. So devastating numbers, but it doesn't of course stop at the autism attention deficit spectrum. 1 in 10 children are now diagnosed with asthma, a lot more have that and are undiagnosed. Allergies are now at 1 in 4 children. Type 2 diabetes and prediabetes are 1 in 4 by college. Obesity at 1 in 3 by college. Major depression is now hitting 1 in 2 adults in America. Cancer, amazingly, has just hit 1 in 2 in American adults. 1 in 2 American adults will diagnose with cancer before they die. And that doesn't count skin cancer. That's solid tumors and blood-borne diseases. So cancer at 1 in 2. Women are at 1 in 3 cancer right now. Dementia, amazingly, is at 100% of our population right now. That's an unfortunate statistic. And unfortunately, I fit into this cat demographic now. In that I originally trained at University of Colorado for my MD, and then went to the University of Virginia where I was in internal medicine, which is kind of hospital-based and primary care outpatient medicine, but ended up getting interested in cancer. I was helping run cancer environments and stuff in the hospital, and then my research during my endocrinology fellowship. Endocrinology is the study of hormones and the way it regulates the body. Dove me into the cancer realm, and I started to really get an appreciation for how devastating that disease can be to the system in regard to the vulnerability of those cells. Those cells that cause cancer are actually the most vulnerable, most damaged cells in your body, and yet they have this kind of unbridled drive for life, and that's kind of the cancer process. And it's kind of cool that down at our cellular level we have an inherent drive for life, and it turns out that our cancer seems to be doing that better than us these days. But during that stay at University of Virginia, a study was done on dementia, and the dementia study demonstrated that by age 28, 100% of our population in the United States is showing early signs of memory processing disorders and dementias. And so none of you look much over 28, but presuming a few of you have reached those milestones, you can start to think back through life and like, well, is that true? Is it possible that I'm having a harder time keeping track of my to-do list, keeping track of my keys? I don't think you probably do on a daily basis, but maybe a few times a month you're like, where the heck did I just set that? Or maybe like me, 4 or 5 times a day, I'm like, where did I just put that thing? And so I have this incredible decline in neurologic function, and it seems to be new. This seems to be something that's really come out of nowhere. And the statistics, again, are pretty extraordinary in their rates. And so this is the graph for autism alone. And it turns out this just goes back to 1975. And so in 1975, we had 1 in 5,000 children with autism. So obviously, in my elementary school, we didn't have any autistic kids. At 1 in 5,000, you had to hit 3 or 4 elementary schools before you were going to find somebody with autism. I had never heard of autism, certainly growing up, and now I was just eating lunch yesterday, or 2 days ago, I guess it was, in Vermont, and beautiful city, and you think, oh, this is a green town and everything else, and I'm overhearing a conversation between a few mothers who says, well, yeah, these 4 schools have autism-only classrooms now and all of it. Like, autism-only classrooms? Like, when did that come about? And the answer is it started coming about right around 2000. By the year 2000, we had hit 1 in 250 kids, so now there was a couple kids in every elementary school that had autism. Then things really got accelerated. We had 1 in 100 by 2010, and at this point, by 2010, we were starting to ask, we seem to have a true epidemic going on in a neurologic condition called autism in our children. And there's a lot of people trying to dismiss that, saying, no, we've just now recognized and defined the disease, and therefore we're diagnosing it more frequently. And we've said that about cancer for years as well. Well, we've just got more CT scans, MRIs, and everything else. But autism is my favorite of the epidemics right now because nobody can deny that it's increasing because it's such an obvious disorder. Nobody missed an autistic kid in 1975. My clinic is relatively populated by autistic children, and these are children that are between the ages of 2 and 5 years old who were speaking and then suddenly not speaking, can't make eye contact, so emotionally perturbed by the afternoon that they start hitting their head against the wall or against the crib, and will hit their head for 3 to 4 hours to the point where they have a big callus on their forehead just so that they can focus and decrease the amount of chaos that their sensory system is taking in. We didn't miss that in 1975, and so because it's such a visible epidemic or visible syndrome, it's a nice one to really be reassured as a population, okay, these are not just statistical mistakes. These are not just very clever doctors being better at diagnosing cancer. No, we have a vertical growth of a neurologic injury. By 2012 is that right-hand number, and that's 1 in 88 children with autism, and then we doubled the rate in just 3 years. And so by 2015, we had doubled our rates of autism. And so we are now on a classic logarithmic growth scale. So if you now look at this, it's an undeniable epidemic, just like you would see with the flu epidemic that would hit the world and kill 20 million people in 1918 and things like this. So this is logarithmic growth of something that we might expect from something like an infectious disease, but we have a logarithmic growth of a disabling condition of the brain of our children. And so that number is pretty extraordinary. And if we extrapolate where we're headed here, by 2035, which is dismally only 17 years away, right? That's 2035 still in my brain sounds like some science fiction movie. That's only 17 years away, which is only a couple of American presidents to get us there, right? And so we've only got a short amount of time before we hit 2035. And at that point, with these numbers climbing at the current rate, we'll hit 1 in 3 children with autism in the United States. 1 in 3 children with autism. And then you look at their their group that might be trying to take care of them, and this is the cancer rates to date. We're doubled in women, and we more than doubled in males. The rate of cancer just in 15 years, that's 1990 to 2015, we doubled our rates of cancer. We're now at 1 in 2. Even if this starts to level off, by 2035, when we have 1 in 3 children with autism, we're going to have 80% of the adult population, somewhere between 70 and 80%, depending on if you're male or female, with cancer. And so these are the numbers that we're now faced with, and it really should bring to focus where we're headed. To speak to it perhaps just in a different context, if the numbers I've thrown out so far are difficult to kind of wrap your mind around, in 1965 the entire population of the United States carried about 4% with a diagnosis of chronic disease. So 4% of the population, man, woman, child, all ages. Currently now in 2015 we hit 46% of our US children with a chronic disease. And so that just gives you a sense of the speed and the age at which we are inflicted with chronic disease. It's super common and super young that we're getting hit. So there's the 2035 numbers again. 1 in 3 children with autism spectrum, 70% of adults at least with cancer. And so now you need to stop and start to realize this is not a discussion about medicine anymore. This just became a discussion about finance. There is no financial system or medical system in the world that can sustain that level of chronic disease. The classic numbers that we know from Vietnam, I don't know if you were around at that time, but one of the weird things that we did from a military standpoint in Vietnam is we decreased the caliber of the M16 to this 283, this small caliber bullet. And it was so that we would not kill as much as we would maim, because they discovered that if we injured a Viet Cong soldier, it took 2 healthy soldiers to take care of the one. So we could actually take out 3 with every one that we hit. And so if those numbers hold true, if 1 in 3 children have autism, it's going to take 2 of those children to grow up to be productive enough to create a financial wealth that's sufficient to take care of that one child. And so that peer group will be completely absorbed in just sustaining the financial burden of one disorder, not to mention any of the other ones on the list. Now you couple that same generation with taking care of the largest geriatric population in history that has the highest burden of cancer in history. We know very well that it takes somewhere around $65,000 a year just for medical bills for a cancer patient. And so you extrapolate that out, we're going to have, this extraordinary, somewhere between $17 and $35 trillion a year medical bill in this country. We will cripple our nation no matter how productive or clever we are, no matter how many robots we build, no matter how much we can't generate enough wealth or enough doctors or enough nursing care centers or enough PTs and OTs and speech therapists and everything else to get us to that level of service. And so we're at a moment in human history. And you're each here, which I find remarkable. Because I don't think we're just human bodies. There's a lot of discussion that goes around in academic and intellectual circles about how many people can the world sustain. 7 billion plus people on the planet now. And a lot of people say that's just too many people. It's okay if they die back, it's okay. Well, it's definitely too many people if we practice an unsustainable, completely consumptive social and political as well as business environment. But if we changed everything, I believe there would be enough space for everybody. Because if you look at raw materials and you look at the amount of space we have on Earth, there's actually plenty of room. If you distribute evenly wealth and distribute evenly land and the productivity of Mother Earth, there's plenty of room for not 7 billion, but many more billions. We can support human life in great number if we completely change our consumptive nature and become regenerative in our philosophies, in our social and political environments, and the rest. And so I really look to this as a hope, because I don't think you guys are a bunch of just animated human bodies. I think you guys are human bodies that are on a mission with a soul inside of you. And I really learned this in the ICUs. I grew up in a Christian church, kind of a hippie church in Boulder, Colorado. I had a homozygote hippie background, both parents hippies. And so I had this very nice church, home church that I was raised in, and pretty kind of open-minded church, but it was really steeped in a lot of philosophy around the soul. And that was kind of interesting to me. I kind of had that mindset, but I don't think I really got it until I started working in the ICUs and started resuscitating people who had just died and bringing a fair amount of them back. And what they told me that they had just seen was just pretty spectacular. You know, it didn't matter if it was an AIDS patient dying from complications of AIDS or an African American Baptist preacher who's dying of congestive heart failure. They all had the exact same experience on the other side. It was pure white light. They felt accepted completely and loved and in complete joy for the first time in their lives. And then in a few seconds, they were suddenly sucked back into a body that had a tube in every orifice. Some guy crushed his ribs just seconds ago, and they're crushing pain in their chest. They've got wires all over them, and they were pissed every time. They're like, why did you bring me back to this? And the majority of them would die in the next few days or weeks, because we don't really prolong life. I think we prolong suffering often for this kind of determinism that just this human body is the whole story. Well, it's not the whole story. There's something much bigger. There's some story afoot. And it's interesting to me when you start to think about a soul that they decide to show up, right? I don't think a soul accidentally shows up in human bodies like, oh my gosh, how'd it get here? I think I'll flounder around for 40, 50, 70 years and see if there's something I can do here. I think they show up on purpose. I think the souls are here on purpose. And if that's true, and we could debate that at length that we don't have time for, but then that would suggest that 7 billion souls, more than ever in human history, showed up right now when those numbers are real. And it's going to take that many people to change everything. We literally have to change everything in the next 17 years. And frankly, that's optimistic. We probably don't have that much time to change everything if we all want to participate. We are going to have a catastrophic loss of life and a catastrophic financial collapse in this country, and it will be followed quickly, if not preceded, by China. China is currently at 1 in 3 adults with prediabetes or diabetes. They're ahead of us. That happened in 7 years, that they went from almost non-existent diabetes to 1 in 3. So they're going to hit a curve, and they have 300 million just in their middle class. We have 300 million as a total population in the United States. And that 300 million is built on a very fragile economic system that they've got going on. And they have no medical system. They have only hospitals. They don't have primary care doctors. They are not prepared to handle the epidemic that they're about to face. So I think those two major ones, the US and China, are definitely going to fall quickly. The EU may hang on and stumble through, but their numbers are not much behind the United States. Australia is going down faster than the US right now. Lots of South Asia is going down quickly. There's not many places in the world that are not manifesting these numbers, and you guys all showed up right now. You showed up right now on purpose. So if we each find our purpose, I think we're going to do phenomenal things together to rethink everything. The way we eat, the way we drink, the way we garden, the way we interact, the way that we build public policy, the way that we take care of our communities, the way that we take care of our farmers, the way that we take care of our children, the way in which we take care of our mothers who might be having children. All of this needs to be rethought quickly, and it needs to have a massive force behind it. Both financially, for sure, we need to redirect our industry, we need to redirect all of our financial interests, but more than that, we need to change the direction of inquisitive nature of humans. We are incredibly good problem solvers. We're very curious creatures. And I think if we all put our curiosity here on this fundamental problem of we now are failing in biologic life, 1 in 4 women in the United States is infertile now, of fertile age. 1 in 3 males are infertile right now, and it's not getting talked about. There hasn't been a single CDC notice to warn us that this is happening. We're literally, as a species, losing the ability to procreate. That's interesting. That's terrifying. And then we have other examples of species that this has happened to, and they rarely live more than 20 to 30 years after that moment where they tip under that fertility mark. So as soon as we hit 1 in 2 infertile, we're at 1 in 3 right now, 1 in 2, that's where we start to see drastic drops in population number. Again, some people think that might be a good thing for the planet, and there's times when I do too. Because we talk about invasive species a lot in the horticultural and gardening environment and all of this, but I think we're really the only invasive species on the planet. We're the only one that really mucks with everything and changes its natural order and separates it from its natural order. And so we are the most invasive species, and we will die if we don't change. And that's in the natural order, and it certainly plays out under the microscope. I'll show you how it all works. This is the incidence of neurodegenerative injury in adults. So if the numbers on autism aren't resonating with you, this perhaps is more concerning. This is from 1975 to 2005, looking at the trajectory of Parkinson's disease. Males have had this trajectory, and now it's going steep. I don't have the 2005 to 2020 numbers here, but it follows the other numbers where you start to get steeper. Interestingly, males don't have much more Alzheimer's dementia. They have Parkinsonian dementia and other types of dementia, but not so much Alzheimer's. But women are the opposite, and so they've had almost no change in, this is women with Parkinson's. Males have not had much increase in Alzheimer's, but females have. And so the females with Alzheimer's and the men with Parkinson's have had this really steep trajectory since the 1980s and mid-1990s. It got steeper. And it turns out that if you look at both of those diseases, both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's dementia under the microscope, you end up with the same pathology as these little tangled plaques of protein in the brain. So it looks like we really have the same process going on in over the last 20, 30 years in male and female brains to destroy our function. Women are suffering it more in the memory category from this kind of pure Alzheimer's. Men seem to get it more in the motor environment, and so they're affected by the motor neurons and their inability to initiate motion, which is very interesting. That there's some deep philosophical lesson in there that I'm sure you guys could tease out for me. But women losing their ability to remember, what happens when a society stops remembering where they've been? We start to repeat, right? And this is my concern, of course, with war, right? We are on war cycles where we have these massive catastrophic wars and we forget about them, and then we build a society that's bound to do the same thing again. And so we have short memory. And now when we take out of the maternal, nurturing mind, and we all have a maternal side to us, but if we take out of the maternal experience memory, you start to wonder what the day is going to look like, what repetition and how short are those repetition cycles going to get when we lose that. When men can no longer initiate motor function, what is the productivity of the world going to look like? And we're facing that situation right now. It's an extraordinary moment to be human. So my background's in cancer. I want to just give you a little bit of a sense of what we're starting to learn, because so far I've been telling you there's a bunch of human disease, but I'm now going to tie this back into the microbiome, because this is where my area of expertise has become focused, is really on bacteria, fungi, and this microscopic world around us and its contribution to the diseases that we have. And this started coming out when I was designing chemotherapy in the 2000s, and my lab group would literally sit around and laugh at these articles that were coming out of UCLA and UCSD that, a bunch of hippie doctors out in Colorado think that bacteria, or the lack of bacteria, are causing cancer. And it sounded so ridiculous because we really believed that cancer was a genetic disease. And then that ended up being proved out very thoroughly, and then it got to the point where now in 2014 this study came out. And this study was extraordinary. This study started to look for DNA of bacteria in the breast of women with breast cancer. And they did something brilliant, was they didn't only biopsy and look for bacteria in the diseased breast, they looked at it in the healthy breast on the other side. And they found something extraordinary. What they showed is that the breast with the tumor in it was enriched in a bacteria called Methylobacterium. Methylobacterium is a very rare species within the microbiome of the normal human, healthy human, but it was suddenly really overpopulated and became the dominant species within the breast tissue. Well, that's bizarre perhaps to you. Whenever I give this lecture, I gave this lecture a couple months ago to 6,000 doctors, and it was jaws on the ground because they didn't know that there's bacteria in human tissue. We know there's bacteria in the gut, on the skin, things like this, but the news that there's actually bacteria in the human breast is weird, and still something we're trying to wrap our minds around. And the way that they proved that out was by looking at the healthy human breast to show that Sphingomonas, a totally different species, was abundant in the healthy breast tissue. And so what an enormously interesting thing to find out that there's lots of bacteria and enriched in the Sphingomonas in a healthy breast. And what we're now learning is that a healthy breast or a healthy prostate or a healthy lung or any organ in your body should be taken care of by a species of the microbiome. There should be bacteria that are nursemating the human cells to provide nutrients to them. Because I don't know if you realize this, but when you eat a plate of food, it's not for you. Your cells have no use for any of that food on the plate. It's absolutely, biologically, biochemistry, impossible for a human cell to eat anything on your plate. The only thing that can eat that food is the bacteria and the fungi, the parasites that are in your gut. And so it consumes all that food and turns it into two major sources of fuel, which would be the fat and the sugar. And then a building block called protein, right? Well, those three kind of macronutrients have to be trafficked inside the body, and most of the protein is converted by the liver to glucose. And so now you have two fuels, fat and sugar, and that is still useless to the human cell. Human cell can neither use fat or sugar. And so it has to feed, your bloodstream has to feed the mitochondria, which are bacteria like guys that live inside your cells, to convert the fat and sugar to one molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And that ATP molecule is the only molecule the human cell can run on. That's extraordinary. And so you're multiple times separated from the fuel that you would run on. First, dependent upon the bacteria and the fungi to break it down. They would then feed the mitochondria. The mitochondria then would finally feed you. These little guys are very sensitive to toxicity, as are the bacteria and the fungi. And so we have these multiple non-human species that live outside of our cells and within our cells that dictate the ability of a single human cell to be alive, let alone 70 trillion human cells to be in my body right now working in concert. And so it's an extraordinary new thing we're learning is that cancer is perhaps a perturbation not in the human cell, but actually in the organic garden that should be a human breast or a prostate or whatever tissue that cancer is going to come from. And so when they first saw this, they said, well, methylobacterium must be causing the cancer. Maybe it's like an infectious disease. You get methylobacterium, then you get breast cancer. Well, if that's true, then we should see that there's an inverse correlation between the amount of bacteria in the breast and the aggressiveness of the cancer. It should look like an infection. And what they found was the absolute opposite. And so they found that the bacterial DNA load within the tumor tissue was inversely related to the aggressiveness of the cancer. What that means is that the less bacteria that were present, the more aggressive the cancer got. The ones that grew no bacteria, had no bacterial DNA in them, the women died the fastest. What an extraordinary discovery, is that the bacteria are actually there to do damage control, and they're trying to save the woman. And when we find a breast tumor, we put the woman through chemotherapy. And when you put somebody on chemotherapy, they're on a couple forms of antibiotic because you just wiped out their immune system. And so in that process, we are very likely to sterilize the tumor. In which case, if that cancer ever comes back, it's going to come back sterile and damn aggressive. And that's what we see over and over again. Occasionally we get lucky and we wipe out the cancer and somebody goes for 15 or 20 years without a cancer. But what we're now realizing is we've completely had to eliminate the word cure when it comes to breast cancer because these women 20 years later will come back with the same cancer. We thought that was impossible. But it turns out, no, if you haven't fixed the organic garden and you're sterile, you're going to have a problem eventually with that cancer coming back or a new cancer developing or whatever it is. So there's an opportunity here as a field to say, wow, if you get diagnosed with cancer, you need to go tend the garden. You got to fix the garden. You go fix that garden, you change the terrain of your human body, you're going to radically change the chance of you having a disease or dying from that disease. Because if you get enough good bacteria in there, it looks like it's going to keep the cancer in check. And so it's an extraordinary shift happening where we need to stop focusing on the human when we diagnose cancer and start asking about the bigger ecosystem in and around that human being. The dogma has always been that cancer is the most common human genetic disease. That is impossible because if it was a human genetic disease, it would be absolutely infeasible to mount an epidemic of the condition. Genetic diseases get passed along from generation to generation in a very predictable fashion. It's now recognized that probably 4% of the cancers in the country are caused by some genetic underpinning. 96% are caused by a change in the environment. And so we do not have human genetic disease in the form of cancer. The cancer is just a symptom of a change in the bigger environment. So let's talk about DNA for a moment because it's an extraordinary story because we think of DNA as really being the fundamental of life, right? And so DNA is that classic double helix that was discovered by Watson and Crick back in the 1940s and really teased out with more accuracy in the 1950s. And we continue to redefine kind of what DNA is and all of this stuff, but it's an extraordinary molecule, and we think of it as the template of life. And when we think about the human genome, everybody's getting their 23andMe or their uBiome or their Biome kit or whatever it is, and they're able to now, just for a couple $100, look at their entire genome, which is kind of cool. And it starts to give you a sense of, I'm really human, and here's my human DNA. Well, that may or may not be relevant because let's take a look at the numbers. Each human cell contains about 1 meter of DNA. Interestingly, the adult human body contains more than 50 trillion cells. So 50 trillion cells is hard to wrap your mind around. The number 50 trillion is only slightly larger than our national debt, but it's an interesting number. And so 50 trillion, that one's hard to picture, but a meter you got, that's about the length of my arm. So you got 1 meter of DNA inside of every one of your cells. So if you took, can you stand up for a moment? Can we use you as an example? All right, this beautiful woman here is going to stand next to me for a moment, and she's going to hold out her arm there for me. All right, so she's got about 1 meter to the middle of her head and another meter there, so that's maybe 2 meters. Very good, you can put those down now. So now take a look at this woman and think about what 50 trillion cells in her body would look like now if we took each meter of DNA and strung that all the way around the world. Do you think we could get her all the way around the Earth? 50 trillion cells would probably make it once, yeah? So yeah, she'd wrap around Mother Earth. How many times do you think she'd wrap around Mother Earth? 100 times. This dude's crazy. 100 times she's going to wrap around. Any other guesses? All right, it's 2 million. This woman right here would wrap around Mother Earth 2 million times. I Googled the other day, because I was putting together another presentation, I Googled to be human. And the first 32 hits on Google Images is Wonder Woman. And it gives you pause of like, if that's what we think it is to be human, I'm not sure what conclusions that draws about us. But then you look at this woman, and you realize she does wrap around Mother Earth 2 million times with the DNA that she has. And that gets injured every time she walks out in the sunshine, wakes up on Mother Earth where there's all this radiation coming out of the planet. She damages her DNA throughout the day, every day. She has to repair her entire genome that wraps around Mother Earth 2 million times, 2 or 3 times a day. She has enzymes that are zipping along that DNA strand, doing repair all of the time, near the speed of light. If we could really see you, when we met you, we would fall down on our knees in awe. Because you are an extraordinary miracle. And at the same moment, she would fall down at the feet of every one of you in awe. We are miraculous. Life is beyond comprehension. That we would make laws to keep each other away from each other, that we would build walls to keep people out from it. It's extraordinary, because human life is divine. It's absolutely at a magnitude that can't be really comprehended by the human mind. Thank you for sharing. And so we need to take pause when we look at the complexity of human life and realize that this genomic information is massive, and there's so much information there, and it's such an amazing amount of DNA that would define life. And we're wrapping around Mother Earth 2 million times, but it turns out that only 1% of your DNA codes for your genes. That's weird. This very much confused researchers as we decoded the human genome, because we thought we were going to have over 200,000 genes, and we only found 20,000 genes. That's a dismal number, because a flea has 13,000 genes. A flea has 30,000 genes, and a fruit fly has 13,000 genes. So you fall somewhere between a fruit fly and a flea, genetically. That's pretty weird. That totally was humbling and bizarre, and it meant that we were wrong about DNA. DNA is not the template of life. DNA is a bunch of potential, but it doesn't define what that child will become in the womb. It doesn't define what human being you are today. Because if just a mere 20,000 genes can build you, it means that there's something else making decisions to make the 200,000 different proteins that you have. There's something way more plastic about being human than we ever thought. And so the amazing thing we're realizing is that there will never be personalized medicine. When I was in medical school back in the early 1990s, we thought we were going to have personalized medicine by 2006, which was we would decode your genome, tell you exactly what diseases you're going to have, and tell you exactly what medications you need to treat those diseases. I was literally told that on the first day of medical school. You are the first generation of doctors that will practice this. You will be targeting human disease like never before. Instead, I am the doctor generation that is impossible for us to keep up with the amount of disease that's on the planet. We've never experienced this level of disease, and we are further behind than we've ever in understanding disease or the management of it. And so we were completely wrong, and a lot of our wrongness was the belief that we were just human. We're not. So the other 99% of the human genome has been called junk DNA, and I think that's brilliant of scientists. Find 1% and say, well, that's the stuff that's working. The other 99% must be waste product, right? Because you look at it in nature. I was up in nature this morning, and we were going through the bayou, the wetlands, and it's just like waste everywhere. Just nature's just like 99% junk, and then you're always looking for that 1% of miracle, right? It's bizarre that scientists, as smart as they think they are, can justify some conclusion like that. The physicists did the same thing, by the way. They measured 4% of the universe, so that's the only stuff that's in the universe. The other 96% seems to be nothing, so let's just call that dark matter, and we'll base all of our calculations on that, and we'll call it physics. And so every area of science is horribly wrong, and so we're missing the 99%. So just in the last 4 years, we've discovered what the 99% are doing. And one of my scientists that works in my lab is Dr. John Gilday. He's one of the 5 experts in the world at finding microRNA. Turns out that the 99% of your genome that does not make a gene that would go on to make a protein that would build you today, the other 99% is making these tiny, tiny little particles called microRNA. And the cool thing about microRNA is they're a communication network within the genome. And the really stunning thing about microRNA is they leave the body. So this allows a single gene to make over 200 different proteins depending on the information they're getting from the microRNA. So if you breathe a certain amount of air, you just breathe in fungus or bacteria or something else, your microRNA are going to turn on differently and they're going to change the body you build today. And so in just seconds, the microRNA can adapt and change who you are right now. And that was a really cool answer to, well, how does a body decide which it's going to make? So if a single gene we now know can make over 200 different proteins, who's going to decide that? Who decides today if that gene is going to make this product or this product? And it turns out it's the microRNA that's governing that, and the microRNA are pretty extreme because they don't stick around in the same spot. They move around all the time. And the interesting thing is, depending on what your microRNA environment might look like, you could build 4 million different human bodies out of your genome today. So with your 20,000 genes, you could build 4 million different variants of you. That's a lot of options. We're not told that when we're diagnosed with a cancer or heart disease or something else. We're said, this disease came upon you and it's not your fault, it's just kind of random luck, or maybe it's in your genes, and we give all these weak arguments. But they never tell you, hey, do you want to build yourself a new body? Do you think that dementia sucks? Do you think that heart disease is terrible? Do you think that cancer is a bummer? Well, why don't you just build yourself another body? Because you have another 3,000 or 3,999,000 or something to go. Why don't you go build yourself another body? And so that's what we can do when we start to rethink human life, is we can literally build different bodies. And you've probably done this yourself. It's not too uncommon. If you haven't done it, you know somebody who has, where you haven't seen them in 5 years and you suddenly see them and you're like, what did you do? Like, you look different. Like, you built yourself a different body. Maybe they just lost weight, but they usually have different facial shape. They can, all kinds of things. One of these more subtle approaches to this, maybe somebody didn't wake up and decide they were going to change, but have you ever met a couple that's been married for 60 years? What do they look like? Who do they look like? They look a little like each other. Isn't that interesting that their microRNA, it turns out, leaves the body, and they swap microRNA, and they start building a similar body. Have you ever noticed that people look like their dogs? Well, guess what? It turns out that the microRNA of a dog can leave the dog and go affect your genome. And if you're looking a little more Labrador today than you did 5 years ago, you might want to rethink that and get yourself a Schnauzer or something else and just mix it up. Because you stick with one species a little too long, and you may get a little hairier than you think. And so this is an interesting reality, is microRNA leaves the body. And we are just starting to decode the microRNA world. But we already know that at least 15% of the microRNA in your bloodstream right now is from the bacteria in your environment. Another 15% is from the fungi in your environment. And amazingly, just in the last year, it was discovered that at least 5% of the microRNA in your body right now is from the DNA of the meat or the plant that you just consumed. That's concerning because I've spent a lot of time in the agricultural environment in the recent years. And you can think about this down on the horticultural scale, where you're looking at your gardening and you're looking at your community and you're looking at the roadsides and everything else. The plants in your environment are coding for your genome just as much as the bacteria and the fungi are. And so if you have a stressed out cow that was raised in a feedlot, and I've spent some time on feedlots, and one of my companies is developing some solutions to help improve the health of cows, because we think that the health of the cow is transferring to the health of the human being that then consumes it. And the way that we think this is happening is mostly through the microRNA. Has anybody heard of panic attack? It's a form of generalized anxiety disorder. Happens in women very commonly now. 1 in 3 women in the United States have some form of generalized anxiety disorder, and among these very common conditions is panic attack. The most common time for a woman to tell me she had a panic attack is about 1 o'clock between 1 and 2 in the afternoon. Her kids are at school, she's at the lowest stress state she'll be in all day, and that's when her body trips into a panic attack. And I've changed my approach. I used to be like, well, what were you thinking about at the time, and try to figure out what was going on in her. And I now just ask, well, what was on your plate 2 hours ago? Did you happen to eat a chicken salad at lunch? Yeah, of course I ate a chicken salad. I always eat a chicken salad at lunch. Well, that chicken was hatched and reached boiler chicken stage in 7 weeks. It was butchered in 7 weeks. A third of its flock had died from invasive infection by that 7-week period. The chicken was never allowed out of its cage. It had its beak clipped off. It's being shat on by the chickens above it. It had never seen sunlight. It didn't know what grass smelled like. It didn't know what its purpose was here. And every fiber of that chicken was screaming, "Help! I'm dying! Nobody cares!" And then we butchered it and we put it on a plate thinking it's chicken, but in fact, it is a message that as soon as the microRNA goes into our body, it screams, "Help! I'm dying!" And it turns on the panic state of an isolated dying species, and this woman can't just figure out why she has this sense of impending doom. We are literally what we eat, and it's becoming more and more real today. Not only are we what we eat, we are the emotion of what we just ate. We are the sense of consciousness of what we just ate. And that's a stunning story about the importance of the food that we consume and the food that we produce for our children. So let's take a look at the bigger picture. If all this microRNA from the microbiome is really shaping who we are and what we feel and what we think, then we need to rethink, what is the genome? Human species, one species, only 20,000 genes. Again, that's 2/3 as complicated as a flea. Not very impressive. 40,000 species of bacteria in your healthy human environment. Now, the 40,000 species has an impressive 2 million genes. So you are logarithmically outnumbered there. But then we look at the parasites. The parasites are 300,000 species of these guys, only a few of which we've really detailed out. Many of them are very important to human health, by the way. If you didn't have this little worm that lived underneath your eyelid, you would develop eye disease very quickly. But we fortunately are inhabited by parasites all the time that take care of us. Those 300,000 species of parasite have 2 billion genes. Then we get to my favorite category, which is definitely the fungi. 5 million species of fungi. Guess how many we have here gene-wise? 125 trillion genes. 125 trillion genes versus our 20,000. This is now 3 times, 4 times the national debt of 125 trillion. So this number is getting massive, right? So 125 trillion genes compared to our measly 20,000. Then we get to the mother of them all, which is the viruses. We don't even know how many species of virus are on the planet right now. They are too numerous, and they change too often for us to even categorize them as species, and they're constantly swapping genetic information. But we do know how many viruses there are as total number. There's somewhere around 10 to the 31 viruses on Earth today. That's a very large number. That's a 1 with 31 zeros after it. That number has no name. It's interestingly 10,000 times more than our stars in the entire universe. I'm sorry, 10 million times more. 10 million times more than our stars in the entire universe are the number of viruses on the Earth today. So let's just take a look at that for a second. If we are logarithmically outnumbered by the invisible life around us, what is the chance that an intelligent public health policy would be to vaccinate our population to 6 or 10 of those? Does it make sense? Does it make sense that among that massive kingdom, there's a few that want to kill us? I would argue as a physician and a scientist now that if they didn't want us here, we wouldn't have showed up. They all seem to understand the role of humanity among us, and it's allowing us to be here. And in response, over the last 150 years, we've done everything we can to kill all of it. And the era of the antibiotics is very real, and it's taking a huge effect. This is actually our gene pool. It's the entire planet and all of its ecosystems, and the more we kill it, the more we will die. This is the checks and balances of human life on Earth, is that if we screw with biologic life, and we just decide we are so narcissistic that we can wipe everything out around us, we'll simply die. We can't survive without them, and that's a nice checks and balances. The cockroaches will survive us, and they will take back over the planet if we do not cooperate. We're designed very specifically to need them. At this point, you're either believing me or not, and there's probably both of those sides of your brain, because you don't want to really believe me, because this better be all wrong, or else you need to go change your retirement plans, because you now got to go change the whole world, because you just found out some information. All right, well, if I'm right, then we should see a huge correlation between our destruction of bacteria through antibiotic use and the death from cancer or any other disease. And so these are maps from the Centers of Disease Control. This is our current cancer death rate. And so the redder the state, the higher the death rate. White is actually also a high rate of death. So the white is almost as bad as the yellow here. So they have a very bad color chart as far as I'm concerned. The dark blues are the lowest rates of cancer. So we have this huge swath of cancer through this side of the country, and it's hottest down here in the red. And in the red, we can see a lot of states mixed in here. And if we look over on this side, now this is from a New England Journal of Medicine article in 2013, showing us the antibiotic prescriptions per 1,000 persons. And in this case, the darker the state, the more antibiotics are prescribed. I hope you can notice that for every state we prescribe a lot of antibiotics, we have the highest death rates of cancer. I showed you a few minutes ago why that is. The more sterile the cancer gets, the more aggressive it is and more likely it is to kill us. And so there's a perfect correlation between physician behavior and our antibiotic prescriptions. Amazingly, these numbers are really gross. This turns out to be 833 prescriptions for every 1,000 human beings. That's what we're currently prescribing. 833 prescriptions for every 1,000, or 83% of our population is getting a prescription from their doctor in any given year for an antibiotic. Gross. Well, that's so much antibiotic that we can't prescribe more antibiotics. It's actually, we've tapped out the amount of antibiotics physicians can prescribe at any given moment. But if we look back in time, it turns out that our cancer map didn't look anything like that. This is 1970 to 1994. So within my lifetime here, we have seen a complete reversal of the cancer map. And so here, 1970 to 1994, I've broken them into the different cancer types, but you can see that they all have predominances up here in the northeast and then in the northwest. This is colon cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer. And so we can look at these different cancers and see this huge predominance in the northeast or the northwest. And so that's been the map. And so we used to think that voting Democrat caused cancer. But then this happened, and suddenly just in a short 15-year period, we reversed the map. Now keep in mind, cancer's gone up around the whole world, right? And including this, every state in this country has gone up in their cancer rates. But something's gotten in here to cause a logarithmic rate of increase in cancer, to where it used to be the lowest area of cancer in the whole country, and now it's the highest. And we did that in 15 years, which should be absolutely impossible knowing the pathophysiology of cancer. We did something to the global environment of the United States that would change in a heterogeneous population genetically, right? We have Asians, we've got Mexicans, we've got the black community down here in the South. We have a very heterogeneous population here, and yet they all did that. And so something happened geologically or geographically that really changed our cancer epidemic. And it doesn't seem to be coming from the physicians. We didn't change our behavior. We have been prescribing the same amount of antibiotics year on year for the last 20 years. And so that's looking at the stable rate of antibiotic prescription, which again is about 830 prescriptions for every 1,000 people. But we've been doing that kind of damage for a good while. So we don't seem to be responsible for whatever happened here when it comes to the microbiome. This is the antibiotic that I think caused everything to happen. This is a molecule you may not have heard of yet, but you use it every single day, either directly or indirectly. It's called glyphosate. And glyphosate is a very close cousin to Agent Orange. It's called an organophosphate. Agent Orange was made by a small company you've never heard of called Monsanto, and they used it for warfare, right? In the Vietnam, what were we using it for? Killing the trees, to defoliate the jungles, right? So we could see the Viet Cong shoot them with small caliber weapons to try to disable them so they'd have to all take care of their damaged people. Turns out the war got over in the mid-1970s, and suddenly there was not a demand for all this chemical they'd been making, and they knew that it caused cancer, so they needed something a little less toxic. And so they looked for an organophosphate of the same family that was less toxic, and this one had happened to be patented back in the 1950s, 1959, by a Japanese researcher who made the chemical and patented it. And they started buying it up, thinking that we're going to find some use for this chemical. And when they first did it, they thought it was going to be really brilliant for cleaning pipes. You know, calcified deposits within sewage drainage and things like this they could be basically a biochemical roto-rooter and clean deposits out. So they started using it for this, and then they found out that whatever was on the end of that pipe died. And so we killed all of the green stuff that was coming out the end of the pipe, and they said, well, that's too bad, we just killed a bunch of that, but there's a market for that. We could kill plants, and we could do it with the farmers. And so in 1974, they patented it as a weed killer, you would think, but actually they didn't. It actually got never patented as a weed killer. It did get put in as the active ingredient to Roundup. Roundup became the most successful single weed killer on earth, and it's what you guys use every day in your community. If you're not spraying it on your gardens, I guarantee your community is spraying it on your roadsides, in your parks, all over the place. And that chemical now is the biggest kind of single chemical worldwide sprayed, and that chemical has never been patented as a weed killer. It's been patented as an antibiotic. Interesting. And so now we've got a chemical that we're spraying worldwide to kill weeds, and yet it's actually an antibiotic, and so we're killing the microbiome of the soil we spray that on, which means we're going to start to grow plants that are deficient in nutrients, because the microbiome for a plant, just like in the human, is what feeds us. So we're going to start growing plants in soil that do not have the food and supplements that are needed to grow a healthy immune system and a healthy body, and so those plants are going to suffer. And when they suffer, their immune system goes down. They're going to have pest problems, and they're going to have invasive weed problems. Well, the chemical company is super happy about that because they can sell you pesticides and herbicides. And so it develops a very nice codependent relationship with the chemical industry. And this is not just happening on the gardener level. This is happening at our large-scale agricultural level by the 1990s. And so we start spraying this chemical. The chemical is interesting because we've been told by all the chemical companies that it's safer than water, which is always hilarious when somebody makes a comment like that. But it's safer than water because we don't have the target of the chemical. What it's targeting is an enzyme pathway that humans don't have. And that sounds reassuring. Well, at least it can't get inside our body and block some enzyme pathway that would kill us. Well, then what does that enzyme pathway do? It turns out that glyphosate blocks the shikimate enzyme pathway that's only in bacteria, fungi, and plants, but not in humans. And in plants, fungi, and bacteria, what we never really asked is, well, what the heck is that enzyme doing? And it turns out what those enzymes are doing is making the aromatic amino acids. These are the building blocks for life. There's only 26 building blocks for proteins. This is very similar to the English alphabet, where there's 26 dominant amino acids that will build the vast majority of your protein structure. And so the amino acids are being built, and there's about 8 or 9 of these that are called essential amino acids. And so these are kind of like the vowels of our English alphabet. If you start subtracting vowels, you start misspelling lots and lots of words, in this case proteins, and you start building a weakened body. It turns out that the building blocks they're deleting include tyrosine, tryptophan, and 5-HTP. Those are the building blocks for our neurotransmitters. If we were to delete out the neurotransmitter building blocks, we would expect our children to have a very difficult time with sensory processing and neural processing because they're deficient in the fuel for those neurons, because they literally can't get the building blocks from the food that they're eating because it was grown in an environment that was steeped in Roundup or glyphosate. And so we are subtracting out the building blocks, the essential building blocks that we can't make in our own bodies by using glyphosate on the food that we consume. And so those are, again, a list of those, some of those essential amino acids that are made in that environment. And now if we look now at glyphosate and say, well, is there a correlation between glyphosate and maybe the rate of cancer? And so I pulled these maps, and I was very disappointed to find out that there was maybe a little bit of correlation in that I was all in the Midwest here that we were spraying it. And then there's a big strip all the way up through here where we are in New York and Vermont and all of that. So we've got a fair amount of glyphosate being sprayed along the East Coast, and then a huge dominant patch in the Midwest, but it didn't correlate perfectly with our cancer rates until you find out one extraordinary fact is that toxin is water soluble. You're not going to be able to see it real well from where you are right now, but this is the United States in white outline here. And in red, this massive thing that takes up some 85% of the United States that then turns into this tornado-looking structure right here and then ends right down in the little strip there is the Mississippi River. This is the tributary system of the entire Mississippi, and it picks up some 85 to 90% of the glyphosate sprayed in the United States. And it's a water-soluble toxin that will be concentrated throughout that water system. And it turns out that the last 90 miles of the Mississippi runs between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana. Guess where the highest rates of cancer in the entire developed world are? Baton Rouge to New Orleans. We call it Cancer Alley. Highest rates of cancer in the entire world. We have put one chemical into the system that is water soluble that kills bacteria massively. It's become the biggest antibiotic in the world, and it's now being sprayed at an extraordinary volume. And it's being sprayed in your backyards, it's being sprayed on your driveways, it's being sprayed in your roadways, it's being sprayed on your food because we developed genetically modified Roundup Ready crops. So why is GMO bad? Now you know a short answer to that. There's many things wrong with it. But the short answer to why is GMO bad? Because it allows our food to be steeped in a chemical that is an antibiotic that's going to kill the bacteria and fungi in the soil, and it's going to kill the bacteria and the fungi in the stomach of your children, the intestines of your children. You as an adult are going to get sterile eating an antibiotic in the form of glyphosate, which is again water soluble. 70% of our world is water. The earth is 70% water. Our bodies are 70% water. The entire life on planet is 70% water, and we put a chemical into that that is water soluble and gets everywhere. Recent studies have shown that 70% to 75% of the rainfall samples taken in this Cancer Alley kind of area is contaminated with glyphosate, the rainfall. 75% of the air they breathe is contaminated with Roundup. And it turns out that's the same case with California through our agricultural environment there, and much of the East Coast, including where we are today. We're breathing an antibiotic. It's raining on us, it's raining on our fish, it's raining on our birds that are out in the wetlands. We are being steeped in an antibiotic. The United States actually is using a little less of this than other countries, but let's now correlate this with a couple other diseases. This is mental illness, and you'll start to see that historically it was the Midwest that had seasonal affective disorder and really high rates of depression. And if you gave them sunshine, the depression would improve. Suddenly our Sun Belt is caught up and in some states is beating the Northwest for the amount of major depression and anxiety disorders. Again, a pretty good state-by-state correlation with the amount of Roundup there. Infectious diseases. You guys are very famous in this neck of the woods for Lyme disease. It turns out that Lyme is only one of the many bacteria and odd microbiome that live in ticks. And we used to think that that was what was causing all of our Lyme disease. But it turns out that if you take a look at our highest Lyme disease rates, they follow our glyphosate spraying map really carefully. Until we killed the microbiome, Lyme wasn't a dominant piece of anything. We had to screw up the balance of the ecosystem with a broad spectrum antibiotic before Lyme or any other pathogen could come to be. Did any of you in elementary or school or high school hear of somebody who had a candida problem? No. Not until 1990s did we all suddenly all have a candida issue, and everybody got candida in their gut and candida in their bladder and candida here and candida on their skin, and all the babies have candida now, and it's all over because we made them sterile bacteria with a widespread antibiotic. Has anybody heard of gluten sensitivity? Did anybody hear of gluten sensitivity before 1992? And the answer is we really didn't. Glyphosate usage worldwide. In 2015, over 2 billion kilograms of glyphosate was sprayed worldwide. That's 4.5 billion pounds of single chemical antibiotic. We are slaughtering the microecosystem of the planet with a single chemical. And we have an opportunity to change that. And you have an opportunity to do that locally before we tackle the world. My companies are starting to tackle the big agricultural environment, but we can't do the microenvironment as well. It's actually going to be harder for us to change your community than it is for us to change big ag. And so I travel all over the place asking you guys to get in touch with your community leaders. And you have an amazing one here with Edwina and this whole Perfect Earth mission here. Somebody got a bee in her bonnet to save the world. And she knew that a part of that was to change the chemical spraying in the yards and the parks and everything else in her environment. And she's asking you to join her. Some of you have. Some of you maybe have an opportunity to join her now bigger. If you guys don't change your local environment, there will not be children here in 30 years. It's that upon us. We have a decision to make. Are we going to change everything, and are we going to do it locally? And then the whole world will change because everybody can do it locally. All right. Another look at glyphosate and its direct effect on the human body, because so far I've told you that it destroys the microbiome, and the chemical companies have been arguing that this doesn't hurt human bodies directly. Of course, the World Health Organization finally came out and said, yeah, this is probably our carcinogen. Now California's made a big push to get it included on the Prop 65 and all of that to get it listed as a carcinogen. I'm a former cancer researcher. In my laboratory, we have over 60 years of cancer research expertise in the lab, and all of us know what cancer cells look like under a microscope, and I can tell you that it happens very quickly when you expose human cells to glyphosate. And I'm going to show you kind of that mission here, or what happens. It begins in the gastrointestinal tract. So your gastrointestinal tract is your biggest exposure to the outside world. The outside world is kept away from your immune system by a single cell layer. And so this kind of like coral reef structure here is the small intestine. And these big coral reef projections here, these finger-like things, are lined by a single little tiny line of cells that are called epithelial cells. And those epithelial cells are the barrier between the outside world, everything you put in your mouth, all the chemicals, all the food, all the water, and your immune system that sits right behind it, which is the GALT, the gastrointestinal lymphatic tissue. Some 60 to 70% of your entire immune system, your whole body, lies right behind that barrier as the front line of defense between you and the outside world. It's a big surface area. It covers 2 tennis courts in surface area. It's your largest exposure. And yet it's only 1 cell layer deep. That's half the thickness of a human hair. Picture a piece of cellophane across 2 tennis courts that's half the width of a human hair. That's what protects you and your children from the chemicals that you have in your environment. 1 cell layer thick. That seems like really poor engineering. We should have like 30 cells there. Let's build up our front wall of defense. Why would we have 1 cell layer? This is the story of checks and balances biologically. Something planned for our worst mistakes. If this species starts to really muck it up and put chemicals everywhere and destroy the microbiome, they're going to suffer very quickly. They're going to be a very sensitive species. And we are very sensitive. And we are killing ourselves right now. And we're killing our children, we're killing ourselves, because we are 1 cell away from the outside world. And if we lose that barrier, we lose our sense of self-identity. That barrier system is made of trillions of tiny little cells that are all glued together. And then by gluing them together, we need a protein structure again. And the protein that does that is something called a tight junction. They're depicted here as these little staples that kind of staple a few cells together. And if we break those cells, now everything from the outside world can go right into your immune system unregulated. This is what we call leaky gut. Leaky brain is the same phenomenon. And so we can break any tissue barrier, whether it's this or the vascular system. Endothelium of all of our blood vessels is also tied together with the same Velcro-like protein structures, the tight junctions, and so is the blood-brain barrier. And so your brain is only protected from what's in your bloodstream based on the integrity of those tight junctions or Velcro proteins. Unfortunately, your kidney tubules are also tied together with the same protein structure. And so if we were to develop a chemical that could damage tight junctions directly, we would turn the entire population into a leaky sieve on the front end. We would start to leak toxin and organic material into the body that shouldn't be there. We would have to start mounting an immune response to our whole environment. And as we lose our self-identity at the cell level, we might start attacking ourselves with something called an autoimmune disease, which is our immune system attacking ourselves as if we were foreign material. Currently today, 1 in 4 girls by the age of 12 is attacking her thyroid with her own immune system, 1 in 4. Amazing rate of confusion as to what's the outside world because we're breaking the front. Then we would break the tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier and we would start to leak and we'd see a lot of neurologic inflammation and overwhelm and we'd see a lot of disorder in our children. By the time they were in their teens, they would be in major depression, anxiety disorder, and we would see a huge amount of dementia syndromes in our adults and we would start to see neurologic degenerative conditions like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and all of that by the time we were mid-age. And then the kidney tubules would fall apart and we'd be unable to detox our bodies through the kidney pathways and we would turn into sponges for toxin, which is precisely what's happened to our entire population. So this is, I hope you can see this from where you sit, this is really the heart of what we've done in our laboratory over the last 7 years. We've really studied extensively that barrier system of the tight junctions and the relationship to Roundup or glyphosate. So this is a small intestine that's now grown in our labs. And what we've done is we've done something really cool. Science is really cool. And sometimes I have to dork out just for a minute. What we do here is we develop an antibody to tight junctions by exposing that protein of the tight junction to a rabbit. And the rabbit reacts to that and builds an antibody against it. Then we purify that antibody, we take that, and we tag it with a glow-in-the-dark jellyfish protein. That's really cool stuff. All right, so that was the dork out part. Jellyfish protein glowing on an antibody that tags a single protein to show you where the tight junctions or Velcro are. And you can see that these cells are all Velcroed together to create a solid sheet or a barrier system between your immune system and the outside world. At 20 parts per million of glyphosate, which is about what you would see in a conventionally grown potato or beet or any root vegetable that I would recommend to my patients, 16 minutes later the whole system has fallen apart. With one chemical, we sterilize the planet, therefore losing the whole basis of life, which is micronutrient delivery and the intelligence of the incredible genomic information of the microbe or life that's going to build you a body today, is now missing. We deleted out the essential amino acids that were important for building everything from our neurotransmitters to our sex hormones and our reproductive capacity. We then, with the same chemical, added a destructive nature to the very front line of defense, and we opened up a leaky sieve across the membranes. One chemical so far. This is 1990. We were growing wheat in this country as a major staple crop and had been for hundreds of years. In 1992, we came up with a very clever decision. Monsanto came along and said, we're really not selling enough of this weed killer. What could we spray it on? Maybe we could start spraying our food. Well, of course, the farmer's like, you can't kill my crops. That's my lifeline. But then Monsanto's like, no, there's one crop you have to kill before you can eat it. What's that one? Wheat. Wheat has to be dead and dry before you can harvest it. So in 1992, they came up with a clever program where they stopped selling weed killer to the farmer there. Well, actually, they were happy to sell that, but they came up with a new product line and said, this is not a weed killer, this is a desiccant, a drying agent. And so they said, just spray this on your wheat fill and it will dry it prematurely and you'll be able to harvest early. And if you're a northern farmer that has your crop at risk by the end of the growing season, and if it snows early, you just lost your entire crop, boy, don't worry. If you've got a storm coming, just spray your whole crop with Roundup. It will be killed immediately. And in 2 or 3 days, you can harvest the whole thing instead of waiting for the paint to dry. And that's literally how they act. Well, you're just waiting around, waiting for the wheat to die. Well, what would happen if a grass or a wheat would grow up and build a seed pod? And that seed pod would slowly turn into a dry head of wheat that would then, in its time, be picked and delivered to the customer in the form of ground wheat, versus a premature death to that seed head. Would the protein structure in there look the same? Would the carbohydrate or the fibers look the same? No, nothing looks the same in prematurely killed wheat. So in 1992, we started killing wheat prematurely and putting it right into the food chain. And interestingly, by 1994, we had a big spike in an autoimmune condition, an immune system where we were starting to attack our own body, and that immune system was triggered by wheat. It was called gluten sensitivity initially, and then it became celiac disease. And now we have gluten sensitivity, which is non-antibody based, and we have celiac disease, which is the autoantibody disease process that destroys our gut lining as an autoimmune disease triggered by wheat. The black line here is the number of acres sprayed with Roundup year to year since 1993. And the yellow bar is the rates of celiac disease in our country. And you see a huge correlation between the number of acres sprayed, i.e. the amount of wheat entering our food chain with glyphosate residues on it and wheat that's prematurely killed, and our reaction to that wheat that would then cross-react with our own body and destroy our gut lining and turn us into celiac patients. And so we have this huge disease being triggered by this one chemical. This is going to be hard to see perhaps with the light that we have flowing in here, which is wonderful. I love the sunshine coming in. But quickly, this is again the glow-in-the-dark jellyfish protein on ZO1, and it's gluing together all these cells that are now glued together. You can't see the cytoplasm. These are the nucleus within the cells. The cytoplasm is black, but they're glued together. Now the cytoplasm has fallen apart, and you've got these train tracks where you have 2 green lines between the nucleus instead of just one, and you've blown those apart, and you have leaky gut from the gliadin, which is a protein within the gluten that's present in one slice of pizza. So now one slice of pizza can suddenly blow apart your gut lining and cause a huge inflammatory reaction. Why? Because we've changed the lining of this gut, and the way in which we did that was exposing that gut to glyphosate. And so if you take a control intestinal membrane and you expose it to gluten, you get a little bit of a dip. You'll do a little bit of injury, but the body can usually deal with that. But if you add glyphosate in a tiny amount that you would come on that wheat, you suddenly get an 80% drop in the protective quality of your gut and your leaky sieve, and now you're reacting to the wheat and everything else in your environment. You suddenly have food allergies, food sensitivities, you've got environmental sensitivities, you've got all of this stuff happening because we just opened up the leaky sieve with the same molecule that sterilized your environment and took away the building blocks for human life. All right, so our group has now teased out exactly the mechanism by which this is happening, and we're trying to get this published. Not surprisingly, the first 2 journals we've sent this to haven't wanted to publish this one. But we did publish that data that we just saw on that previous slide, showing that glyphosate is synergistically damaging to the gut lining. That one got published. This one shows exactly how it does it. So this is the smoking gun, and this one's proving a little tougher to get somebody to publish for us. But glyphosate exposure upregulates the receptor by which gliadin will cause the leaky gut. And so we've been able to show that now. We're trying to bring that one to be. So gliadin binds CXCR3 receptors to trigger zonulin production. Zonulin occludins toxin pathway is what opens up the tight junction to cause not just leaky gut, but also leaky vasculature and a leaky blood-brain barrier. And it's telling that the main symptoms of gluten sensitivity are not bowel related. It's not bloating and it's not irritable bowel, it's not those things. Those can be present, but the number one complaint of gluten sensitive patients is brain fog, neurologic. Number 2 is sleep disorder. Number 3 is depression symptoms. Number 4 is gastric upset, GI symptoms. So the top 3 conditions are actually the brain barrier falling apart, not the gut barrier falling apart. We're turning ourselves into leaky sieves by the co-induction of glyphosate and gluten along not just the gut barrier, but the blood-brain barrier pathways. Then it gets really trippy, and I'm going to just show one slide because I love looking at the miracle of life. 2 cells are glued together here, one on top, one at the bottom, and there's a whole series. This is now showing under an electron microscope what looks like a spot weld. And there's just some sort of dense protein structure that's tying those 2 cells together in this little band. And that is a very, very tiny spot. That's about a tenth, this whole radius here, diameter of this structure, that diameter is about a tenth of a human hair. And so just tiny, tiny little structure. And if we blow that structure up in a cross-section, we find out it's not one structure, but it's hundreds of thousands of tiny little fibers that look like a cable running between one cell and the next. If we go to a higher electron microscope look, it turns out they're tubes, they're hollow. Each of these tiny little structure here is a hollow tube that's beautifully built in construction. Now we're at 1,000th of the width of a human hair, and you've got these perfect tubes. And then even more extraordinary, at the end of every single tube looks like a flower, but when you blow up that flower shape, it turns out that it is an aperture, just like on the end of a camera lens, letting light energy to and fro. It turns out this spot weld is something called a gap junction that runs between one cell and the next to transfer light energy. You are not a biologic creature, you are actually an atomic physics creature. You're not made of the material of cells, you're made of the material of atoms. And atomically, you are extraordinary. I mentioned the mitochondria earlier. The mitochondria are these little things that look like bacteria that live inside your cells and they make all of your energy. Turns out that 1 cubic centimeter of mitochondria makes 10,000 times more energy than 1 cubic centimeter of the surface of the sun. You are 10,000 times more powerful than the surface of the sun in energy production at your mitochondrial level, and all of that is in the form of electrons, electricity. And the electricity in the form of light and energy is being passed from one cell to the next through this exquisite system of fiber optic cables that are regulated very carefully with what information is traveling between your cells. And this incredible system is liced apart as soon as you show glyphosate to the cells. What is cancer ultimately? Cancer, as it turns out, is a cell that has forgotten it's part of a larger organism. It has become so isolated. All of the proteins that were connected to its environment and cellular structures around it have become lysed, and that cell has become lonely and does not know that there's life outside of it, and all it knows is it's a very damaged cell. The average human cell has 20,000 unrepaired injuries at the genetic level. That's pretty amazing since we only have 20,000 genes. There are a lot of screwed up base pairs in a cancer cell. So that damaged, unrepairable cell thinks it's the only thing left at life, and so the only option it's got is to procreate. So it just starts replicating itself over and over again, saying, I've got to hold on because I am so short-lived. Cancer cells die constantly, so they have to replicate faster than they're dying. We are literally looking at a $500 billion a year in chemotherapy in this country right now. $500 billion in the cancer industry being dumped into the loneliest cells in our body. And we just poison them more, we poison them more, we poison them more, thinking we've got a public health effort to kill cancer. It's the opposite of what our cancer cells need. And so when a cancer patient ends up in my room, the first thing I teach them how to do is love their cancer. It's the most important thing is to realize that cancer is you. It's from you, and it needs to find out it's from you. And so you need to start screaming your name and identity back into that cell. And we're going to give you a lot of supplements and other things for the microbiome to get your fiber optic cables to reattach and get that information transferred. But you need to know that you are real, and you hold your space, and you are 70 trillion cells that are glued together in great purpose to carry out some soul mission that is maybe yet to be defined, and you showed up right now. And so we have this awesome story that unfolds in cancer in my clinic, is that it is the greatest moment in my patients' lives to find themselves. Whether they go on to die from that condition or they go on to survive and beat that condition, they find themselves in the journey, and that's worth the journey right there. And so before you get cancer, find yourself. Scream at yourself in the mirror in the morning, I am who? Who are you? Scream your name, and then listen. Listen for what you're here to do. Because you showed up right now, and we have to change everything in the next 17 years if we're going to survive together. And we can change it all together, and there's heroes among you that you can join. This is a quick snapshot across the course of life from age birth to age 78, the average life expectancy in the United States of all the kind of the cascade of diseases that we expect to happen. It starts with colic and goes to sensory processing deficits and ends with vascular disease, cancer, and dementia. And so there's this very predictable pattern of this inflammatory cascade through life. We rank 49th in the world for health outcomes in this country. Croatia, Peru, all of these countries rank well ahead of us. War-torn countries with almost no infrastructure are having better health outcomes than the United States of America. 49th in the world for health outcomes. We're number one in one category, though. Number one for neonatal death on day one in the developed world. More children will die on day one of life in the United States than any other developed country in the world. That number hit in 2012. Which maybe coincidentally was the year that we started to mandate the hepatitis B sexually transmitted disease vaccine on day one. Well, if we have all that disease, haven't you ever heard that thy food is thy medicine? Dates back to Hippocrates, who got us all the credit. Of course, the Chinese medicine doctors were saying that 2,000 years before him. So for at least 4,000 years, humans have recognized the food is in the medicine. And if we're that diseased, 49th in the world, 46% of our children with a chronic disease, well, we should just feed them food, because the food should be their medicine. Well, it turns out that the same shikimate pathway that's blocked by glyphosate is where we get the alkaloids. And the alkaloids are the medicine within our food. The alkaloids are the antiparasites. If we took out the quinine compounds within our food chain, within all of the beautiful fruits and vegetables, if we took out all these compounds, we would expect to see a lot of unregulated parasite conditions. Something like Lyme disease would become epidemic in the community. If we were to take out the anti-asthma compounds of ephedrine and things like this that are naturally occurring in the food, we would see a ton of asthma in our children and adults. If we were to take out the Homo Harrington category of all of our colored fruits and vegetables, we would expect to see a ton of cancer in the environment. If we were to take out the galantamine from our nutritional base, we would see a ton of sensory processing neurologic conditions because of the lack of the cholinomimetics. We'd have autonomic nervous system dysfunction. We would see a ton of hypertension because vincomine would be removed. We would see a whole bunch of antiarrhythmic cardiac death because we lost quinidine and its family. We'd have a ton of chronic pain in the world if we eliminated the alkaloids from our food chain, because the analgesics in our food look a lot like morphine, and our food forever treated that pain. But if we were to spray all of our food with something like glyphosate that would block that, we would see a lot of chronic pain. We would see a ton of diabetes because it turns out that piperine is really rich in a lot of our foods, and now has none because we grow it in a glyphosate-rich soil, and we've lost that and we have diabetes. And so it turns out that not only have we created a sterile world without bacteria, a world in which we are destroyed in our own self-identity as humans by the destruction of tight junctions that now allow the whole world to enter. Our immune system is overwhelmed, and our kidneys can't clear it, and our brains are being steeped in all the subsequent toxins, and so we get disease, and we can't treat the disease with our food because the same chemical took the pharmaceuticals right out of our food. Well, it's perhaps not a coincidence that that company, Monsanto, has been owned by pharmaceutical companies for the last 30 years, because that's a pretty good idea. If a pharmacy, it would be smart to own the company that's removing the pharmaceuticals from the food chain in the first place. So every seed of genetically modified ground-up drenched food that you've planted would then guarantee that that individual was going to build a human body that was deficient, and it would become diseased, and it would have no pharmaceutical in the food. So as a cancer researcher, I worked a lot with vincristine. Vincristine is one of the most common antibiotics on the planet. The way that we make vincristine is very simple. We let the algae do it for us. It's not some fancy chemical. It's just in our food. Vincristine is one of the most common alkaloids in our food, but it's depleted in all of the food crops, and so now we turn to algae to grow our vincristine for us. And so we make these algae beds in these protected greenhouses, and we grow vincristine and purify it out, and we sell it for $28,000 a gram. It's some 6 times more expensive than gold now. It's a naturally occurring compound that should have been in your food chain and always was up until the late 1980s, 90s. And so we have destroyed the medicinal features of our food with one chemical. So this is the legacy of glyphosate on the planet right now. And again, the main places this is sprayed is actually certainly in the agricultural environment, but the second place is in the horticultural environment, in the yards that you guys take care of. And so we are decimating the world through these following ways. And so we'll have those integrated in. This video is going to eventually be on the website, and so you guys can go back and note this if you didn't have the chance to take notes on these efforts and you need that information. But it turns out that Mother Earth has grace, and if this was just a really bad story, I wouldn't have asked you guys to all come out. I'd just say, we should all eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we'll die, and that's not a bad plan. Scripture said to do that anyways. And so we might just go that avenue. But my best friend in medical school happened to have the opportunity to become an astronaut and spent 7 months on the International Space Station. And Kjell Lindgren took a lot of pictures of the aurora borealis from space. That's the northern lights from space. Doesn't that look a little bit like a halo? I think that Mother Earth is gorgeous, and I think Mother Earth is our guardian angel because she's done something pretty extraordinary. In 2012, in the very soils that we're spraying 4.5 billion pounds of antibiotic into a year, in the fossil soils from 50 million years ago, my group discovered a family of molecules that grace of Mother Earth would give us that would be the antidote to the Roundup. And so we have found that the microbiome from 50 million years ago has created an antidote to this chemical. And it's made by the bacteria and fungi in your gut right now today. But the important part of this is that every species of bacteria and fungi makes a different subset of these carbon molecules. We used to think that the bacteria just delivered fat, sugar, protein, and micronutrients to the body. We now know that probably the most important piece of this puzzle is these molecules here. And so in 2012, I was going through a white paper on soil science, and that molecule was sitting on page 42. And that molecule, turns out, if you picture that in 3 dimensions, looks a lot like the chemotherapy I used to make. And so I had this goosebump moment of realizing why I am here, my purpose, what is my soul here to do? I went through all those years of education, 17 years of academia, house mortgage worth of school debt, so that I would be prepared in a split second to recognize a molecule that I could have walked by 1,000 times and say, there's something to that molecule. And when I found out that there's millions of variants of that in the soil made by bacteria and fungi, I was getting goosebumps because the molecules I had been working with were made by mitochondria. And I knew that they killed cancer and they did all kinds of cool things to the immune system. They dictated cellular repair. And the idea that the mitochondria might be doing that inside our cells and the bacteria and the fungi might be doing it outside the cells suddenly answered the whole question of how could it possibly be that bacteria in our breast or in our bloodstream or in our colon could predict or treat cancer. It might be doing it through this whole communication network of these carbon molecules. And so that's the journey we've been on. And what we have found out that this has nothing to do with cancer, ultimately, it has to do with something much more fundamental. Each of those carbon molecules is slightly different, just like you would expect of a snowflake. And if we put all of that together, you end up with a wireless communication network. That wireless communication network has now gone into the dietary supplement line called Restore. It's available at a lot of your health food stores, and a lot of your doctor's offices sell it and things like this. It's become the big building block piece for us because of what it does to the whole system that I just showed you. It is the information stream that keeps the proteins being produced by your DNA that would keep you protected from the outside world, among a number of other things I'm about to show you. But here's the intestines again. Control. You show it glyphosate, the whole thing falls apart and develops precancerous features within 16 minutes. Terahydrite, if you add back all of those molecules, the active ingredient in Restore now, you get the zippering effect of the whole tight junction system where you end up with 40 or 50% more tight junctions in Velcro than you had at Control. And now when you add glyphosate, the whole system stays intact. Now the exciting thing is, and we still can't really figure out how it is happening to this degree because it defies quantum physics at this point, but it turns out that we can add 20,000 times more glyphosate than would show up in your food, and we still cannot break those tight junctions if the terahydrite is present. And so an extraordinary story has unfolded that if you get a wireless communication network made of millions of variants, i.e. diversity within the microbiome that's making these carbon snowflakes, you become bulletproof at the gut lining. If you shrink that microbiome and you start to lose chunks of that communication network, you become vulnerable at the intestines, the whole system falls apart. And so until we destroyed the microbiome with our farming practices, we were resilient. And we can be resilient again. Has anybody traveled over to Europe with some gluten sensitivity to find out they can eat a croissant in Paris without a problem? This happens to my patients all the time. And they freak out. And I'm always just like, well, why did you come back? Like Paris, croissants, no gluten sensitivity, buy an apartment, whatever. Do something, don't come back here. And it's because we haven't completely destroyed the microbiome of the whole planet quite yet. Although it's fast on the heels. If the whole rest of the world doesn't learn from the United States and what we've done, we're only maybe a decade away from everybody else catching up with us to the level of devastation they'll pull out of that situation. So lots of peer-reviewed science. I'm not going to go through this because I've already gone over time and I was under strict requirements to get you guys to your next functions, but we're talking about the survival of the species, so I thought I'd drag this out a little bit. All right, so we appreciate your focus and attention. I could talk for a lot more. This is just a slide looking at the effect on the blood-brain barrier quickly in case you favor your brain. This is your blood-brain barrier at control. If you add back the bacterial communication network from 50 million years ago, you get this almost doubling of the blood-brain barrier. If you add gluten, for example, to the small intestines, you see that huge drop in the blood-brain barrier. You've got brain fog. But if you add back or keep that bacterial communication network in place, your blood-brain barrier is stronger than when it was at control. And so we have this massive protective effect. We've shown how this is done. It's largely through the upregulation of these DPP-4 enzymes. The bacteria and the fungi through their communication network will make the human make proteins and all kinds of protective qualities. So the gluten, the glyphosate, and some other kind of invasive chemicals can become toxic peptides that will break the tight junctions and cause leaky gut and also inflammation. And then if we add back the restore and the terahydrite, we get the DPP-4 enzymes increasing, and it protects at all these different locations. Also speaks directly to the mitochondria. I'm not going to go into deep depth on this slide, but what you see here is stress level within mitochondria. This is in minutes in real-time PCR, looking at their stress level by the amount of reactive oxygen species they make. As soon as you add in the communication network of the bacteria and the fungi, it takes the stress off the mitochondria. I love that story. It turns out that the bacteria and the fungi are talking directly to your mitochondria, and all of them are taking care of you. Because you are loved, because you're on purpose, because you're human, and you're supposed to be part of this great ecosystem. So that's a bunch of the story. I want to do, just as a last thing, just thank my group. But on that thing, I want to just show you real quick the solution for you guys. And the solution lies in not just a dietary supplement, but it lies in your lifestyle. Soil management is the most important way to return medicine to your community. It's the most important way for you to return a foundation of health. And so your soil management and your care for the mycelium and the fungi and the bacteria, composting, stop spraying glyphosate, go to your local groups, get them to outlaw Roundup, get them to get some loop in the legislative environment that could get this thing pushing in the environment. Don't be disappointed when they tell you there's actually a federal legislative thing that was put into play by the chemical companies saying that local governments could not pass ordinances to block Roundup. It's literally in our federal law saying that no community can decide to overcome this. Well, I don't agree that because legislation gets turned over all the time, and I'm asking you to help make a massive stink in your community in New York and start to change these local laws to get us to stop spraying and killing our microbiome. Support the permaculture and biodynamic farming, support regenerative agriculture. Doesn't need to be organic, right? Just know your farmer. That's the answer. Know the farmer, and that's much better than a USDA organic stamp. Most of the organic growth in the United States is actually destroying soil still. Regenerative practices are done locally, and you guys can find them here. You guys have a very vibrant farm community throughout New York, and I encourage you, if you're not currently supporting a CSA and you're not currently growing your own garden, you need to jump in and do that. So how do you stay healthy in a toxic world? Number one, you need to make sure that everybody who's going to birth a baby near you is taking care of their microbiome, and they birth vaginally. A C-section is a sterile birth, and that child doesn't get mom's bacteria and ends up with hospital bacteria. That kid will have ear infections and will be on antibiotics by the time they're one. if they're born by C-section and not swabbed with mom's vaginal mucus. So if a C-section happens, swab down mom's vaginal canal and wipe it all over the baby. Eyes, ears, nose, nares, this. And don't be embarrassed to say that. You could save that kid's life. If that's your grandchild and your daughter-in-law ends up having a C-section, that's not her fault. That's a screwed up medical system that's not supporting her. But tell her right away, let's just have the nurse swab the vagina and we'll just cover the baby in that with that good bacteria that's going to protect that child, and you probably add decades of life, certainly a whole lifetime of health potential to that child. So don't be embarrassed to go and push for that. Grow your own food, breathe in the nature. We get a lot of our microbiome from breathing new environments. And so you guys have a lot of environments in small amounts of space. Go breathe that and you will repopulate. You will get stronger. If you get an antibiotic, for God's sakes, go outside immediately. Steep yourself in the dirt, sit in the soil, eat from the garden, get out on the waterways and breathe the wetlands. Go and sit with a wild turkey if you can sit long enough. Commune with Mother Nature and she'll repopulate you really quickly and protect you from that antibiotics damage. And so get re-engaged. Stand barefoot in the grass and soil. Nakedness gets huge extra credit from me. Eat fermented foods every day. We've done this through all human history until we invented refrigeration, and then we got lazy. Ferment food, get it in your system, and most importantly, hug, kiss, and generally celebrate every animal, human and otherwise, that you will touch in a day. And I think we can all turn this thing around. Thank you for your attention. This is my whole team that keeps all that information going. And thank you guys.